Ladies and gentlemen, gather close if you dare, for tonight we venture into the shadowed corridors of a legacy steeped in darkness, a tale that whispers through the ages like a chill wind through forgotten tombs. Imagine, if you will, a grand estate perched on the edge of a mist-shrouded cliff, its windows like hollow ice staring into the abyss, where the Westbrook family once reigned with an iron grip masked by velvet gloves. From the flickering candlelight of 18th-century England to the cold steel of modern secrets, this is no mere history. The night was thick with fog, the kind that clings to the skin like a damp shroud, when Elias Westbrook first stepped onto the grounds that would bear his family's name for centuries. It was 1743, and the young merchant had just acquired a sprawling estate on the jagged cliffs of Cornwall, a place the locals called Blackthorn Manor even before he claimed it. They whispered warnings as he passed through the village, tales of lights seen flickering in windows that had stood empty for decades, of cries carried on the wind from the sea below, of fishermen who vanished when their boats strayed too close to the rocks beneath the cliff. Elias laughed them off, a sharp, ambitious laugh that cut through the tavern smoke like a blade. He had made his fortune in the shadowy corners of trade, dealing in spices and silks and things less spoken of in polite company. Superstition, he declared, was the refuge of the poor and the fearful. But on the very first night he spent in the manor, something changed. The household staff, few as they were, for Elias preferred privacy, retired early, leaving him alone with a decanter of brandy and the creak of an old house settling into itself. He sat in the grand library, maps and ledgers spread before him, plotting the expansion of his empire. The fire burned low, casting long shadows that danced across shelves lined with books he had yet to read. Then came the sound, a soft, deliberate scraping, as if fingernails were dragging slowly down the inside of the walls. Elias froze, glass halfway to his lips. The scraping stopped. Silence rushed back in, heavier than before. He told himself it was the wind, or rats, or the imagination of a man unused to such isolation. But when he rose to investigate, his candle guttered violently though no draught stirred the air. In the corridor outside the library, he found the portrait. It had not been there when the previous owner showed him the house. He was certain of it. Yet now it hung prominently above the staircase, a life-sized painting of a woman in mourning black, her face pale as bone, eyes dark and depthless. Her hands were clasped at her waist, but one finger pointed subtly downward, toward the floorboards beneath her feet. Elias approached, drawn despite himself. The plaque beneath read simply, Amelia Westbrook, 1698 to 1721. He had no sister, no aunt, no relation by that name. Westbrook was his name alone, newly minted with wealth. There had been no Westbrooks here before him. That night, he dreamed of her. In the dream, Amelia stood at the edge of the cliff, wind whipping her black veil, beckoning him closer. When he reached her, she turned, and her mouth opened not to speak but to scream, a soundless, endless scream that pulled at something deep inside his chest. He woke gasping, the echo of that silence ringing in his ears. The next morning, driven by a compulsion he could not name, Elias pried up the floorboards directly beneath where the portrait hung. Beneath layers of dust and rot, he found a small iron box. Inside lay a locket with a miniature of the very woman in the painting, a lock of auburn hair, and a folded letter written in faded ink. The letter was addressed to "My dearest Elias," though no Elias had lived in that century. It spoke of a pact made in desperation, of a bargain struck with something that dwelled beneath the cliff, of a price paid in blood to secure prosperity for a family yet unborn. Elias burned the letter. He took the locket and hurled it into the sea. He ordered the portrait removed and stored in the attic. But the scraping returned that night, louder, closer. And in the weeks that followed, villagers began to speak of seeing a woman in black walking the cliffs at dusk, her finger pointing ever toward the manor. Years later, when Elias lay dying, far younger than his wealth and power should have allowed, his final words were not of regret for ambition or lost love, but a warning rasped to his only son, "She waits beneath the floor. She always waits." And so the hook was set. From that first chilling night, the Westbrook family was bound to something older than the house, older than the cliffs themselves. A presence that did not haunt the halls so much as claim them. What began as a merchant's triumph curdled into inheritance of a far darker kind. The portrait reappeared, no matter how many times it was destroyed. the scraping echoed through generations. And the name Westbrook, once spoken with envy, became one uttered only in lowered voices, for everyone knew the family's rise was not earned by trade alone, but purchased at a cost that would be paid, again and again, by those who came after. This, my friends, is where the macabre history truly begins, with one man's refusal to heed a warning, and the moment the shadows of Blackthorn Manor first reached out to claim a bloodline forever. Elias Westbrook did not remain alone with his secrets for long. Wealth has a way of attracting those hungry for alliance, and within a year of settling into Blackthorn Manor, Elias married Eleanor Vane, the daughter of a bankrupt baronet whose name still carried the faint polish of old nobility. The wedding was lavish, held in the great hall beneath chandeliers that dripped wax like blood onto the flagstones below. Villagers were invited, partly out of magnanimity, partly to silence their whispers. They came, ate, drank, and left with full bellies but uneasy hearts, for even amid the music and torchlight, the portrait of Amelia had been rehung in its place above the staircase, her painted eyes following every guest as they ascended. Eleanor brought no dowry but beauty and ambition sharp enough to match her husband's. She dismissed the servants' talk of scrapings and shadows as rustic folly and set about transforming the manor into a seat worthy of the rising Westbrook name. Rooms were redecorated in crimson silk and dark mahogany. Glass houses were erected for exotic plants Elias imported alongside his cargoes of indigo and opium. Visitors from London began to arrive, merchants, minor lords, scholars drawn by rumors of Elias's private library, which now included volumes bound in unfamiliar leather and written in scripts no university could fully decipher. By 1750, the Westbrooks stood at the pinnacle of provincial society. Elias had secured a seat in Parliament through judicious bribes and favors. Ships bearing the family crest sailed to the Caribbean and the East Indies, returning heavy with profit. Blackthorn Manor expanded, new wings rose like dark fins from the cliff's edge, cellars were dug deeper than necessity required, and a private chapel was consecrated where no priest from the village church would ever agree to officiate. Instead, Elias employed a wandering scholar priest named Father Alaric Crow, a man whose Latin carried an accent northwest one could place and whose eyes seemed older than his face. It was during this ascent that the first child arrived, a son, named Nathaniel after Eleanor's father, born on a night when the sea raged so violently that waves crashed over the cliff itself. The midwife, an old woman from the village, fled the birthing chamber white-faced, refusing payment and muttering of a shadow that stood behind Eleanor's shoulder throughout the labor. Eleanor laughed at the tale, cradling her perfect, fair-haired boy, but Elias noted how the infant's eyes, even in the cradle, seemed to track movements no one else could see. 2 more children followed in quick succession, a daughter, Lydia, whose laughter echoed strangely through the corridors as though answered from empty rooms, and another son, Gabriel, who from infancy recoiled from the portrait of Amelia as if it burned him. With each birth, the family's prosperity swelled. Estates in Yorkshire and Jamaica were purchased. Whispers at court spoke of Elias as a man touched by fortune itself. Invitations to the finest houses arrived sealed in gold wax. Painters were commissioned. The Westbrook lineage now boasted multiple portraits lining the grand gallery, Elias stern and triumphant, Eleanor radiant in pearls, the children solemn beyond their years. Yet beneath the polished surface, the whispers persisted and grew. Servants vanished without notice, replaced by new ones who asked fewer questions. Ship captains who sailed for the Westbrooks returned wealthy but hollow-eyed, speaking vaguely of cargoes that moved in the hold when no living thing had been loaded. In the village, livestock was found drained of blood under the full moon, and children were warned never to stray near the manor gates after dusk. Father Alaric Crow conducted ceremonies in the private chapel at hours when decent folk slept, and strange lights, greenish, cold, were seen glowing from its stained glass windows. Eleanor, ever practical, turned a blind eye to anything that might threaten her position. She hosted balls where masked guests danced until dawn, orchestrated marriages for her cousins into merchant families, and cultivated friendships with duchesses who envied her jewels. But even she could not ignore the night in 1759 when Lydia, then 6 years old, was found sleepwalking along the cliff path in her nightgown, arms outstretched toward the sea as though guided by an unseen hand. The child was carried back unharmed, but when questioned, she spoke in a voice not her own. The bargain holds. The debt comes due. Elias alone understood the deepening shadow. Late at night, he returned to the iron box he had unearthed years before, now hidden behind a false panel in his study, and reread fragments he had not burned. The pact, it seemed, had not been Amelia's alone but an older covenant renewed by desperation across centuries, binding whichever family claimed the cliff and the ground beneath. Prosperity was granted, power assured, but only for a span, and always at the cost of something unnamed taken from each generation. By the time Elias's hair had turned iron gray, the Westbrook name carried dual weight, spoken with envy in drawing rooms, with dread in taverns. They were untouchable, elevated far above their origins, yet marked. Their rise had been too swift, too absolute, to be mere human achievement. And as the family crest, a raven clutching a bleeding heart, was embroidered on banners and carved into stone, those who understood symbols noted how the bird's eye mirrored exactly the gaze of the woman in the portrait who watched over them all. Thus the origin solidified, a merchant's ambition married to ancient obligation, a bloodline elevated not by merit alone but by allegiance to something that dwelt deeper than cellars, older than the manor itself. The Westbrooks had become aristocracy of a shadowed sort, their prominence a beacon that drew both admiration and fear, for everyone sensed that such heights could only be maintained by paying a price the rest of the world refused to meet. Nathaniel Westbrook inherited the manor and the shadow in equal measure when Elias passed in 1782, his body wasted as though something had fed upon him from within. The son, now 32, had been groomed for power, educated at Oxford, seasoned in the family's counting houses, and hardened by voyages aboard the raven-crested ships. He buried his father in the private chapel beside the cliff, beneath a stone carved with the family motto, *sanguine nostro fortuna*, our fortune in our blood. Few attended the funeral, even allies, since the air around Blackthorn had grown colder, heavier. Nathaniel's reign began with betrayal. His younger brother Gabriel, long tormented by visions and fits that no physician could cure, had confided in Nathaniel years earlier that he intended to break the cycle. Gabriel had discovered fragments of Father Alaric Crow's journals hidden in the chapel crypt, pages describing rituals performed not to appease a benevolent deity, but to sustain something that slumbered beneath the foundations. The priest had written of offerings, a life for every decade of prosperity, willingly given or taken by force. Gabriel begged Nathaniel to burn the chapel, to abandon the estate, to let the Westbrook name fade into obscurity rather than continue the debt. Nathaniel listened, nodded, and that same night summoned 2 trusted servants, men whose loyalty had been bought with gold and fear. They dragged Gabriel, screaming, to the cellars newly reinforced with iron rings set into stone. There, beneath the house, Nathaniel performed the rite himself, using the same obsidian blade described in Crow's hand. Gabriel's blood soaked the flagstones, and for the first time in years the scraping sound ceased. Prosperity surged anew, sugar plantations yielded record harvests, parliamentary influence deepened, and Nathaniel married an heiress whose fortune doubled the family holdings overnight. But blood calls to blood. Lydia, the sister who had once walked the cliffs in trance, watched her brother's transformation with growing horror. She had always been the sensitive one, hearing whispers the others ignored. After Gabriel's disappearance, officially explained as a fever that carried him off at sea, Lydia began keeping her own journal, hidden beneath floorboards in her chamber. She recorded dreams of Amelia, now joined by Gabriel's accusing eyes, and of a growing hunger beneath the manor that demanded more than one life per generation. In 1791, pregnant with her first child, Lydia confronted Nathaniel in the library. She threatened to expose everything, the rituals, the murders, the source of their wealth. Nathaniel, cornered and desperate to protect the legacy he now believed was his divine right, poisoned her wine at dinner. She lingered for 3 days, long enough to give birth to a daughter, named Amelia in bitter mockery, before dying with a curse on her lips, that every Westbrook firstborn would know the blade before their 30th year. The curse took root quickly. Nathaniel's own son, Elias too, grew into a dissolute youth who squandered fortunes on gaming tables and actresses. In 1810, debtors circled like wolves. Facing ruin, Nathaniel descended once more to the cellars, but this time the thing below rejected his offering of hired vagrants and thieves. It demanded family. Elias too was lured home with promises of reconciliation, plied with brandy, and led below. Nathaniel's hand shook as he raised the blade, but he did not falter. When it was done, the family's ships returned laden with gold from wartime privateering, and creditors mysteriously withdrew their claims. Yet the grounds themselves began to rebel. Gardeners found patches where nothing would grow, perfect circles of barren earth that spread year by year. Graves in the chapel yard sank overnight, as though something pulled from beneath. In 1823, during a storm that tore half the cliff away, a hidden cemetery was exposed, dozens of unmarked stones dating back centuries, all bearing the faint outline of the raven and bleeding heart. Villagers fled the area entirely. The nearest hamlet became a ghost town whose abandoned cottages crumbled into the sea. By the time Nathaniel died in 1834, found at his desk with throat neatly slit though no blade was discovered and every door locked from within, the Westbrook name inspired terror rather than envy. His granddaughter Amelia, raised on whispered stories and locked doors, married a distant cousin to keep the bloodline pure and the secret contained. Their children were born pale, with eyes too knowing, and the manor's corridors filled with the sound of footsteps that belonged to no living soul. Later generations refined the horror. In the Victorian era, Reginald Westbrook turned the cellars into a labyrinth of bricked-up chambers, each concealing the remains of those who had outlived their usefulness, servants who learned too much, rivals who threatened exposure, even distant relatives summoned under false pretenses. He kept meticulous ledgers, dates, names, and the corresponding booms in family fortune that followed each sacrifice. During the 1880s, when spiritualism gripped society, Reginald hosted seances not to contact the dead but to negotiate terms with whatever listened from below. Guests left enthralled by the manifestations, ectoplasm, disembodied voices, tables that levitated, never suspecting the price paid afterward in hidden rooms. The pattern repeated across centuries, ambition fed by betrayal, prosperity purchased with kin blood, curses spoken and fulfilled in turn. Each generation believed they could master the bargain, only to discover the hunger grew with the wealth it granted. Graves multiplied beneath chapel and garden alike, a silent testament to the cost of elevation. And through it all, the portrait of the first Amelia hung watchful, her painted finger eternally pointing downward, reminding every heir where the true foundation of Westbrook power lay. The weight of the Westbrook legacy pressed most heavily not on the stone of Blackthorn Manor, nor on the ledgers swollen with illicit gain, but on the minds and hearts of those born beneath its roof. Each heir arrived into a world already tilted toward darkness, cradled by nurses who averted their eyes and tutored by governesses who left within a month, whispering of children who spoke to empty corners. The psychological toll began in infancy, colic that no remedy soothed, nightmares that left sheets soaked in sweat, and an instinctive dread of the portrait gallery where ancestors stared down with faces too similar to one's own. Amelia Westbrook, the one born in 1791 as her mother drew her final, cursing breath, grew into a girl of ethereal beauty and fractured spirit. From the age of 5 she claimed to hear conversations in the walls, Gabriel pleading for release, Lydia weeping over a cradle that rocked itself. She drew pictures in charcoal of figures standing behind family members, invisible to everyone else. Her father, Nathaniel, dismissed it as feminine fancy until the night she accurately described the contents of a letter he had burned years before. After that, he kept her dosed with laudanum, her eyes perpetually dilated, her laughter brittle and rare. Amelia learned early that truth was a dangerous indulgence. She buried her visions beneath layers of etiquette and silence, but they festered. By 20 she walked the corridors at night tracing the scraping sounds with trembling fingers, convinced the house was digesting her alive. When she married her cousin to preserve the line, she did so with the numb obedience of a sleepwalker, already half departed from the world. Her son, Reginald, inherited not only the manor in 1844 but his mother's sensitivity sharpened into something colder. Where Amelia had recoiled, Reginald analyzed. He catalogued every manifestation, the temperature drops before a sacrifice was demanded, the metallic taste in the air when the cellars stirred, the way mirrors fogged with breath that was not one's own. He convinced himself that understanding would grant mastery. Nights were spent in the library poring over Crow's journals and newer grimoires acquired from continental occultists, seeking loopholes in the ancient bargain. But knowledge eroded rather than fortified. He began to see the entity not as a devil to be bargained with but as a mirror reflecting his own hunger. Paranoia bloomed. He suspected his wife of plotting to spare their children by exposing him, his valet of listening at keyholes for Scotland Yard, even the ravens on the cliff of carrying reports back to the thing below. He slept with the obsidian blade beneath his pillow, waking often to find it warm, as though recently used. His journals, written in a hand that grew increasingly spidery, record dreams where he stood in an endless cellar surrounded by every Westbrook who had ever bled, all turning to him with the same accusing question, when will it be enough? The children of each generation bore the brunt most cruelly. They were taught from the cradle that love within the family was conditional upon acceptance of the legacy. Refusal meant exile, or worse. Many developed the hollow effect of those who have seen too much too young, eyes that stared through people rather than at them, smiles that arrived a beat too late. Some escaped into madness that, paradoxically, was treated with indulgence. A raving Westbrook posed no threat to secrecy. Others turned to vice, opium, absinthe, gambling, as temporary anesthesia. A few attempted suicide, only to find doors locked, razors mysteriously blunted, nooses slipping from beams as though unseen hands intervened to preserve the bloodline for later harvest. In the early 20th century, Evelyn Westbrook, great-granddaughter of Reginald, kept a diary that survives in fragments. She wrote of feeling like a tenant in her own body, of moments when her reflection lagged behind her movements, of hearing her thoughts echoed back in a voice not quite hers. She fell in love with a young doctor summoned to treat her nerves, and for a brief season believed escape possible. They planned to flee to Canada under assumed names. On the eve of departure she woke to find herself standing in the chapel, blade in hand, her lover's body already cooling on the altar. She remembered nothing of the act, only the profound relief that flooded her afterward, the temporary satiation of the house. The guilt that followed drove her to swallow laudanum in quantities that finally overpowered whatever force preserved her. Her death was recorded as accidental overdose, the family closed ranks as always. Later heirs grew sophisticated in their coping. Mid-century Westbrooks consulted Freudians in Vienna and Zurich, speaking in careful generalities about family trauma, while the therapists noted an unusual prevalence of dissociative features and command hallucinations. Some embraced the darkness as identity, tattooing the raven crest on their skin, hosting decadent gatherings where guests unknowingly skirted the edge of real sacrifice. Others pursued relentless philanthropy, as though good works could balance ancestral ledgers, an impulse that collapsed under the weight of knowing no charity erased the foundational debt. By the late 20th century the toll manifested in subtler fractures, chronic depression mistaken for aristocratic melancholy, anxiety disorders treated with ever stronger pharmaceuticals, relationships that withered before commitment. The last direct heir, Cassandra Westbrook, born in 1978, grew up in a manor wired with cameras and alarms yet still alive with movement at the periphery of vision. She studied psychology at Oxford hoping to diagnose the family affliction as collective delusion. Her thesis argued that intergenerational trauma, compounded by isolation and suggestion, could produce shared hallucinatory phenomena. She returned to Blackthorn armed with reason, determined to dismantle superstition. Instead she found her own sleep riddled with dreams of drowning in blood that tasted of copper and salt, woke to scratches on her arms spelling words in archaic script, and discovered her research notes rearranged into warnings. The final entry in her journal, dated mere weeks before her unexplained disappearance in 2005, reads, "It isn't in our minds. It's in our blood, and the mind follows." Thus the Westbrook descendants lived suspended between grandeur and ruin, their vast wealth buying every comfort except peace. They were prisoners of a lineage that granted power at the cost of the soul's slow erosion, generation after generation paying interest on a debt whose principal could never be settled. The human spirit, resilient as it is, bent but did not break entirely. Fragments of love, creativity, even kindness persisted like wildflowers forcing through cracked stone. Yet always the shadow lengthened, reminding them that inheritance here meant carrying forward not just fortune but fracture, not merely name but nightmare. Cassandra Westbrook vanished from Blackthorn Manor on All Souls' Night, 2005, leaving behind only a half-written letter addressed to no one, its final sentence trailing off mid-word. "If you read this, do not." The authorities searched the cliffs, dragged the cove below, questioned the handful of remaining staff who still tolerated employment under the family name. They found nothing. No body, no note completed, no sign of struggle. The case was closed as presumed suicide, another tragic footnote in a lineage already littered with them. Yet those who knew the house understood that Cassandra had not fled into death but deeper into the truth she had spent her life circling. For decades the manor stood empty, windows boarded, gates chained, the raven crest flaking from rust and salt air. Local legend claimed the scraping sounds had returned louder than ever, that on certain tides the chapel bells rang though no ropes were pulled. Trespassers, urban explorers, occult enthusiasts, journalists chasing the perennial most haunted in Britain lists came and went, some emerging pale and silent, others never emerging at all. Their cameras captured orbs, shadows, fleeting figures in black veils, but always the footage corrupted before it could be shared widely, as though the house itself refused witness. In 2023, a distant collateral descendant, Dr. Harlan Westbrook, raised far from Cornwall, educated in America, bearing the name only as an academic curiosity, received an envelope postmarked from a village that no longer existed. Inside was a brass key, heavy and old, and a single sheet of paper bearing coordinates etched in Cassandra's unmistakable hand. Harlan, a rationalist historian specializing in debunking aristocratic mythologies, dismissed it as hoax until the nightmares began, dreams of standing in a cellar lit by greenish flame, surrounded by every ancestor he had ever studied in faded photographs, all beckoning him home. He arrived at Blackthorn in the autumn of 2024, armed with skepticism, recording equipment, and a team of postgraduate students eager for fieldwork. They pried open the gates, forced the swollen doors, and stepped into air thick with the scent of damp stone and something copper-sweet beneath. The portrait of Amelia still hung above the staircase, untouched by time or vandals, her finger pointing downward as always. Harlan laughed at first, an elaborate forgery, he declared, but the laughter died when he noticed the eyes followed him exactly as every childhood story had claimed. Over weeks of methodical exploration they mapped the manor room by room, cataloging artifacts, Reginald's ledgers, Evelyn's fragmented diary, the obsidian blade displayed now like a museum piece on velvet in a locked cabinet that yielded to the brass key. They descended into the cellars, deeper than any previous survey, discovering levels bricked up and reopened across centuries, a spiral of descent that seemed to defy architectural logic. At the lowest point they found a chamber whose walls were not stone but packed earth veined with something darker, pulsing faintly like roots beneath bark. In the center stood a plinth, and upon it a book bound in raven feathers and human skin, its pages blank until blood touched them. Harlan's students began to leave, one by one. Some cited illness, others personal emergencies, a few simply disappeared between supper and dawn. The remaining team grew quarrelsome, paranoid, hearing arguments in languages none of them spoke. Harlan alone persisted, driven now by something more urgent than curiosity. He read the book as it revealed itself to him, drop by drop from pricked fingers, and learned the ultimate revelation: the bargain was never with a devil or demon, no external entity demanding tribute. It was older, simpler, crueler. The thing beneath the cliff was the land itself, the ancient hunger of place that claims every family ambitious enough to plant roots too deep. The Westbrooks had not sold their souls to a dark power, they had fed the ground with their own in exchange for elevation above it. Prosperity was merely borrowed time, wealth the interest paid in blood to postpone the moment when the earth reclaimed what was always its own. On the night of December 12, 2025, exactly 20 years after Cassandra's disappearance, Harlan gathered what remained of his courage and descended alone, carrying the blade and the book. He understood now why every generation had believed they could renegotiate, why each had convinced themselves the next sacrifice would be the last. The revelation was not that the cycle could be broken, but that it could not, unless one offered not a single life but the entire line, willingly and completely, erasing the Westbrook name from the world so thoroughly that no heir remained to renew the debt. He stood in the deepest chamber as the walls breathed around him, feeling the accumulated weight of centuries pressing close: Elias's ambition, Nathaniel's betrayal, Reginald's cold calculation, Cassandra's desperate scholarship, all converging here, now, in him. The scraping had become a chorus, voices of every sacrificed kin calling not in accusation but invitation. Harlan raised the blade, not to his throat but to the book itself, intending to destroy the record and with it the covenant. But as the edge touched the feathered cover, the pages flared with sudden script, a final clause, overlooked by every ancestor, written in Cassandra's blood 20 years before. It read, "The debt is not paid by refusal, nor by destruction, but by acceptance. To end the claim, one must become the claim." Harlan lowered the blade. He understood at last. The only way to free the trapped souls, to silence the hunger, was not to starve it but to feed it willingly, wholly, without reservation or regret. To step into the earth not as victim but as completion, merging the last Westbrook with the ground that had birthed the family's rise. He laid the blade upon the plinth, opened his veins over the book, and spoke aloud the words the walls had waited centuries to hear, not a plea for mercy, not a curse upon the bargain, but simple, unflinching consent. The chamber filled with greenish light, warm for the first time, and the chorus of voices rose not in anguish but release. When dawn came on December 13th, the manor stood silent. No scraping echoed in empty halls. The portrait above the staircase showed Amelia no longer pointing downward but gazing outward, eyes soft, almost peaceful. Search parties would arrive later, summoned by Harlan's pre-written letter posted the night before, and find only an empty house, dust settling where footsteps had lately disturbed it, the cellars collapsed into natural caverns as though no human hand had ever delved there. The Westbrook name would fade at last into obscurity, its fortune dispersed to distant charities, its story dismissed as exaggerated folklore. Yet those who walk the cliffs on certain evenings swear the wind carries no cries now, only a profound and final stillness, as if a long unrest has been laid to rest by one who finally understood that some shadows are not conquered by light, nor banished by denial, but embraced until they become the darkness no longer.